Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold. But when Alexandra Sterling discovered the truth about the man who had shattered her heart into a million pieces, she realized that some revenge needs to burn hot enough to turn an entire world upside down. In the glittering world of high society, where million-dollar deals are made over champagne and secrets are currency more valuable than gold, Alexandra thought she had found her fairy tale. The mysterious, devastatingly handsome Victor Dracul seemed like every woman's dream, wealthy beyond imagination, charming enough to make angels weep, and powerful enough to move mountains with a single phone call. But fairy tales don't prepare you for the moment when Prince Charming reveals he's actually the monster under the bed. And they certainly don't teach you what to do when that monster has been playing with your heart like a cat plays with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. What Alexandra discovered about Victor would have destroyed a weaker woman. The elaborate web of lies, the carefully orchestrated manipulation, the cold calculation behind every sweet word and tender touch, it was enough to break anyone's spirit. But Alexandra Sterling wasn't just anyone. She was a woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, who had built an empire with her bare hands, and who had learned long ago that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. When Victor Dracul made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman he had chosen as his prey, he set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just his own dark secrets, but an entire network of corruption and deceit that reached into the highest levels of society. Because sometimes, the hunted, and sometimes, the victim becomes the one holding all the cards. This is the story of how a broken heart became the weapon that brought down a king. Alexandra Sterling adjusted the diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, the only reminder of a life before struggle and sacrifice. Standing in the marble foyer of the Grandview Hotel's penthouse ballroom, she surveyed the glittering crowd of New York's elite. Tech moguls mingled with oil barons, fashion designers chatted with pharmaceutical heiresses, and everyone seemed to be speaking in the universal language of money and influence. At 32, Alexandra had earned her place among these titans of industry. Her cybersecurity company, Phoenix Systems, had grown from a one-woman operation run out of her studio apartment to a multi-million-dollar enterprise that protected some of the world's most sensitive digital assets. Tonight's charity gala for children's medical research was both a networking opportunity and a chance to give back to a cause close to her heart. She had fought for every dollar, every client, every moment of respect in a world that still questioned whether a woman could truly understand the dark corners of digital warfare. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her emerald green dress spoke of success without screaming desperation. She had learned long ago that confidence was the most expensive accessory a person could wear. The ballroom buzzed with conversations about market fluctuations, political developments, and the latest scandals that seemed to follow the wealthy like expensive perfume. Alexandra accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and made her way toward the auction tables, where signed artwork and exclusive experiences waited to be claimed by the highest bidders. She was examining a painting by a contemporary artist whose work she admired when she felt someone's presence beside her. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like standing too close to a fire that promised both warmth and destruction. "The brushwork is extraordinary," a voice said beside her, rich and smooth, with just the hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "But I think the artist was trying too hard to capture something that can only be felt, never truly painted."
Alexandra turned and found herself looking into the darkest brown eyes she had ever seen.
They seemed to hold depths that went on forever, promising secrets and adventures that most people never dared to dream about. The man standing beside her was tall and lean, with the kind of effortless elegance that spoke of old money and older traditions. His black hair was perfectly styled, and his tuxedo fit him like it had been crafted by angels who specialized in making mortals look like gods. "Alexandra Sterling," she said, extending her hand with the practiced confidence that had served her well in boardrooms and business negotiations. "Victor Dracul," he replied, taking her hand in his. His skin was surprisingly cool, and the touch sent an electric shock up her arm that she tried desperately to ignore. "I know who you are, of course. Phoenix Systems has quite the reputation for digital fortress building." Alexandra raised an eyebrow. Most people at these events knew her company by name, but few understood the actual nature of her work. "You've done your homework." Victor smiled, and the expression transformed his already striking features into something that should have been illegal in 12 states. "I make it a point to research interesting people. Your company protected Senator Morrison's campaign from what could have been a devastating cyber attack last year. Impressive work." The fact that he knew about that particular incident surprised her. The details had been kept strictly confidential, known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Either Victor Drackle was very well connected, or he had access to information that he shouldn't have had. "And what business are you in, Mr. Drackle?" she asked, taking a sip of her champagne and studying his face for any tell that might reveal his intentions. "Investment and acquisition," he said smoothly. "I help people find what they're looking for, and I make sure valuable things end up in the right hands." The answer was vague enough to mean anything, and specific enough to suggest he dealt in more than just financial instruments. Alexandra had encountered enough powerful men to recognize when someone was being deliberately mysterious. In her experience, people who spoke in riddles usually had something to hide. But despite her natural caution, she found herself drawn to Victor in a way that defied rational explanation. There was something magnetic about him, a pull that seemed to bypass her usual defenses and speak directly to a part of her that she had carefully locked away years ago. When he suggested they move away from the crowd to continue their conversation, she found herself nodding before her logical mind could object. They walked out onto the hotel's rooftop terrace, where the city spread out below them like a glittering carpet of dreams and ambitions. The September evening was perfect, with just enough coolness in the air to make standing close to someone seem like a practical necessity rather than a romantic choice. "Tell me about your company," Victor said, leaning against the stone balustrade with the casual grace of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he chose.
"What drove you to become a digital guardian angel?"
Alexandra laughed, surprised by the description. "Guardian angel might be overstating it. I just help people protect what matters to them. And what matters to you?" The question was asked quietly, but something in Victor's tone made it feel like the most important question in the world. She considered the question seriously. Most people in her position would have given a standard answer about business success or financial security. But something about Victor made her want to dig deeper, to be more honest than she usually allowed herself to be with strangers. "Control," she said finally. "When I was growing up, we never had control over anything. Whether we could pay rent, whether there would be food in the refrigerator, whether my mother's latest boyfriend would decide we were worth keeping around, or just another burden to discard. I swore that when I grew up, I would never be powerless again." Victor nodded as if he understood something fundamental about her that she had never put into words before. Power is seductive, isn't it? The ability to shape outcomes, to ensure that what you want to happen actually happens. "Is that what drives you?" she asked, genuinely curious about this mysterious man who seemed to see straight through all of her carefully constructed defenses. "Among other things," he said, and his smile held secrets that made her pulse quicken. "I've found that most people don't really know what they want. They think they do, but when you dig beneath the surface, you discover that their desires are much more complicated than they ever imagined." The conversation continued as they watched the city lights twinkle below them. Victor was unlike any man Alexandra had ever met. He listened to her stories about building her company with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered. He asked thoughtful questions that showed he understood not just the technical aspects of her work, but the emotional courage it had taken to build something from nothing. When he spoke about his own life, he painted pictures of a world that seemed both glamorous and slightly dangerous. He talked about traveling to places most people only saw in magazines, about deals that required delicate negotiation and perfect timing, about the thrill of turning calculated risks into extraordinary rewards. "You make it sound like you live in a movie," Alexandra said, laughing as he described a business meeting that had taken place on a yacht off the coast of Monaco. "Life should be cinematic," Victor replied seriously. "Most people settle for existing when they could be truly living. They choose safety over adventure, predictability over passion." "And which do you choose?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Victor stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body, despite the coolness of his skin. "I choose whatever promises to be most interesting," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to vibrate through her entire being. When he leaned down to kiss her, Alexandra felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into an abyss that might contain either treasure or destruction. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about getting involved with mysterious strangers who spoke in riddles and had access to classified information. But the touch of his lips against hers silenced every rational thought she had ever had. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a threat, and a challenge, all wrapped up in a single moment of connection that seemed to rewrite the fundamental rules of what was possible between two people. When they finally broke apart, Alexandra felt like she had been fundamentally altered at the molecular level. Victor smiled down at her with an expression that seemed to say he had known exactly what effect he would have on her, and that this was all proceeding according to some plan she wasn't privy to. "I should go," she said weakly, though every fibre of her being wanted to stay on this terrace forever, wrapped in whatever spell Victor Drackle had woven around her. "Of course," he said, but he made no move to step away from her. "But I hope this won't be the last time we see each other." "I hope not either," she admitted, surrendering to the honesty that seemed to be the only option when she was around him. Victor reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card that was made of heavy black paper with silver lettering. No address, no company name, just his name, and a phone number that looked like it might connect to anywhere in the world. "Call me when you decide you want to choose adventure over safety," he said, pressing the card into her palm, where it seemed to burn against her skin. As Alexandra walked back through the ballroom toward the elevators, she felt like she was leaving behind more than just a conversation. She was leaving behind the woman she had been just 2 hours ago, the woman who had thought she understood herself and what she wanted from life. In the elevator, she studied Victor's business card and wondered if she had just met the man of her dreams or made the biggest mistake of her life. The smart thing to do would be to throw the card away and forget about the mysterious stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and turned her carefully ordered world upside down. But as she rode down toward the street level, Alexandra Sterling admitted to herself what she had known from the moment Victor Drackle had first spoken to her. She was going to call that number. She was going to choose adventure over safety, passion over predictability. She was going to find out exactly what kind of man could make her forget every lesson she had ever learned about protecting herself from getting hurt. What she didn't know, as the elevator doors opened and she stepped out into the New York night, was that Victor Drackle had been watching her for months. She didn't know that their meeting hadn't been a coincidence, that every word he had spoken had been carefully calculated to achieve exactly the effect it had achieved. She didn't know that she had just become the latest player in a game whose rules she couldn't possibly understand, a game where the stakes were higher than money, or power, or even love. She didn't know that Victor Drackle wasn't just a mysterious businessman with old-world charm and modern ambitions. She didn't know about the network of influence and corruption that he controlled from the shadows, about the lives he had destroyed in pursuit of objectives that ordinary people couldn't even imagine. Most importantly, she didn't know that she had been chosen not for who she was, but for what she could provide: access to digital systems that could be exploited, connections that could be leveraged, and a heart that could be broken, in service of goals that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. As Alexandra Sterling walked home through the streets of Manhattan, she felt like she was floating on air, carried by the memory of a kiss that had promised to change everything. She had no way of knowing that in choosing to trust Victor Drackle, she had just signed up for a masterclass in betrayal that would challenge everything she thought she knew about human nature. The game had begun, and she didn't even know she was a player. Alexandra waited 3 days before calling Victor's number. 3 days during which she threw herself into work with an intensity that impressed even her most dedicated employees. She reviewed security protocols that didn't need reviewing, audited systems that were already running perfectly, and generally drove herself and everyone around her slightly crazy with her nervous energy. On Thursday morning, she finally admitted to herself what her assistant Maya had been too polite to say: she was being ridiculous. At 32, she had faced down corporate espionage attempts, government hackers, and boardroom bullies who thought they could intimidate her into submission. She could certainly handle making a phone call to an intriguing man.
When she dialed Victor's number during her lunch break, he answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting by the phone.
"I was wondering if you had lost my card," he said without any preamble, and she could hear the smile in his voice.
"I don't lose things that matter," Alexandra replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Good to know. Are you free for dinner tonight?" The question was simple, but something in the way he asked it made it feel like he was asking if she was ready to step through a door that could never be unopened. Every instinct told her to suggest coffee instead, something casual and safe that wouldn't feel like such a momentous decision. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'm free." "Excellent. 8 o'clock. I'll pick you up." The line went dead before she could ask where they were going or suggest meeting at the restaurant instead. As she stared at her phone, Alexandra realized that Victor Drackle was a man who was accustomed to being in control of every situation. In any other circumstance, That would have triggered every red flag she possessed. Men who insisted on controlling the details were usually men who had something to hide. But something about Victor made her want to surrender control, at least temporarily. Maybe it was the memory of that kiss, or the way he had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. Whatever the reason, she found herself looking forward to 8 o'clock with an anticipation that made it impossible to concentrate on anything else. At exactly 8 o'clock, Victor appeared at her apartment building in a car that seemed to have been designed by someone who understood that transportation could be art. The sleek black vehicle hummed with the quiet confidence of expensive engineering. And when Victor stepped out to open her door, he looked like he had been born wearing that perfectly tailored charcoal suit. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand to help her into the car. The compliment was simple, but the way he said it made her feel like she was the first woman in history to deserve such praise. They drove through Manhattan in comfortable conversation, but Alexandra couldn't help noticing that Victor seemed to know exactly where every traffic light would change and which routes would be clear. When she commented on his navigational skills, he smiled mysteriously and said he made it a point to study his environment. The restaurant he had chosen was the kind of place that didn't need to advertise because the right people already knew about it. Tucked away in an unassuming building in the village, it offered the kind of privacy that celebrities and world leaders paid premium prices to secure. Their table was in a corner that provided a view of the entire dining room while remaining secluded enough for intimate conversation. "How did you manage to get reservations here?" Alexandra asked as they settled into chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "I heard the waiting list is months long." "I know the owner," Victor said simply, as if knowing the owner of exclusive establishments was as natural as knowing the weather forecast. Over the course of dinner, Alexandra found herself revealing things about her life that she rarely shared with anyone. Victor had a gift for asking exactly the right questions, for showing interest in details that most people overlooked, for making her feel like her experiences and opinions mattered in ways they never had before. She told him about growing up in a series of rundown apartments with a mother who cycled through boyfriends like seasonal fashion trends. She described the scholarship that had gotten her into MIT, where she discovered that her brain was wired to understand the logic of computers better than the logic of human relationships. She even admitted to the loneliness that sometimes crept up on her late at night, when the success she had worked so hard to achieve felt hollow compared to the connection she had always craved but never quite managed to find. Victor listened to every word with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. When she finished describing how she had started Phoenix Systems in her studio apartment with nothing but a laptop and an unshakable belief that she could protect people from digital threats, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You built something extraordinary," he said, and the admiration in his voice seemed completely genuine. "Most people dream about changing the world, but you actually did it. I helped a few companies avoid some cyber attacks," Alexandra protested, though his praise sent warmth flooding through her chest. "I hardly changed the world." "Don't underestimate what you've accomplished," Victor said seriously. "In today's world, information is power. By protecting people's information, you're protecting their power. That's not a small thing." The conversation shifted to Victor's life, though Alexandra noticed he was much more skilled at deflecting personal questions than she was. He spoke about his work in vague terms that suggested international scope and significant influence, but he never provided specifics about exactly what his company did or where his wealth had originated. When she pressed him for details, he smiled and said, "My family has been in the business of acquisition for generations. We find things that other people want, and we make sure those things end up where they belong." "That's wonderfully mysterious," Alexandra said, laughing despite her growing curiosity about what he was hiding. "Do you always speak in riddles?" "Only when the truth is more complicated than most people are prepared to handle," Victor replied. And something in his expression suggested he was being completely honest about that at least. After dinner, they walked through the village streets, and Victor pointed out buildings and landmarks with the easy familiarity of someone who had been exploring the city for decades. When Alexandra mentioned that she had lived in New York for 8 years but had never noticed half the things he was showing her, he said that most people only saw what they expected to see. "The real city exists in the spaces between the obvious things," he explained as they paused in front of a narrow alley that somehow managed to be both inviting and slightly ominous. "Most people walk past the interesting parts because they're focused on getting from point A to point B as efficiently as possible."
"And you're not most people," Alexandra observed.
"Neither are you," Victor said, turning to face her with an expression that made her feel like he could see straight through to her soul. That's why I find you so fascinating. When he kissed her again, this time standing under a streetlight that cast dramatic shadows across his features, Alexandra felt like she was falling into something that might be love or might be madness. The rational part of her mind noted that she barely knew this man, that his evasiveness about his personal life should be concerning, that falling this hard this fast was dangerous for someone who had spent years protecting herself from emotional vulnerability. But the rational part of her mind was no match for the way Victor made her feel when he touched her. This wasn't just physical attraction, though the chemistry between them was undeniable. This was something deeper, a sense that she had found someone who understood parts of her that she had never been able to explain to anyone else. Over the following weeks, Victor courted her with an intensity that was both thrilling and overwhelming. He sent flowers that must have cost more than most people's car payments, but there were always varieties she had mentioned loving in casual conversation, accompanied by notes that referenced things she had said weeks earlier. He took her to places she had never heard of but felt like she had been dreaming about her entire life. Private art galleries where the paintings seemed to tell stories about worlds that existed just beyond ordinary perception. Restaurants where the chef prepared meals based on conversations about flavors and memories. Theaters where the performances felt like they had been written specifically for an audience of two. Alexandra's friends and colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior. She smiled more often, laughed more easily, and seemed to carry herself with a new confidence that had nothing to do with professional achievement and everything to do with feeling cherished by someone who seemed to think she was the most important person in the world. Maya, her assistant, made increasingly pointed observations about Alexandra's transformation. "You're glowing," she said one morning as Alexandra hummed while reviewing quarterly reports. "It's a little unsettling, actually. I've never seen you this happy." "Is that a bad thing?" Alexandra asked, though she knew Maya was right. She felt different, lighter, as if some weight she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Not bad," Maya said carefully. "Just different. You've always been so focused, so in control of everything. Now you seem, I don't know, like you're floating." The observation bothered Alexandra more than she wanted to admit. She had worked hard to become someone who didn't need external validation, who didn't depend on other people for her sense of worth or happiness. The idea that she might be losing herself in this relationship with Victor was genuinely disturbing. But every time she saw him, those concerns evaporated like morning mist. Victor had a way of making her feel like the person she had always wanted to be but had never quite managed to become. Confident without being defensive, strong without being rigid, open without being vulnerable to manipulation. He introduced her to his world gradually, taking her to gatherings where she met people whose names she recognized from newspaper headlines and magazine covers, politicians, entrepreneurs, artists, and academics who seemed to defer to Victor in ways that suggested his influence extended far beyond whatever business he claimed to be in. "How do you know all these people?" she asked one evening, after they had attended a private concert where the performer was a Grammy winner who had supposedly been retired for the past 5 years. "I make it a point to cultivate relationships with interesting people," Victor replied smoothly. "You never know when someone might need help with something, or when they might be able to provide help in return." "Help with what?" Alexandra pressed. But Victor just smiled and changed the subject to something else, leaving her with more questions than answers. The pattern became familiar. Victor would reveal just enough about himself to keep her intrigued, but never enough to satisfy her growing curiosity about who he really was and where his power came from. When she tried to research his company online, she found only the most basic corporate information, and a website that was beautifully designed, but remarkably uninformative. Her attempts to learn more about Victor's background through her professional contacts were equally fruitless. People knew his name, respected his influence, but seemed reluctant to discuss specifics about his business dealings or personal history. The few details she managed to gather painted a picture of someone who operated in the shadows of legitimate business, someone who specialized in making problems disappear and opportunities appear. Despite her growing unease about the mysteries surrounding Victor's life, Alexandra found herself falling deeper under his spell. He had a gift for anticipating her needs before she even recognized them herself. When she mentioned being stressed about a particularly difficult client, he arranged for a weekend retreat at a private estate in the Hamptons where she could decompress in luxury while still having access to secure internet for essential work communications. When she expressed frustration about a competitor who seemed to be stealing her ideas for cybersecurity protocols, that competitor suddenly found themselves facing a series of unexpected business setbacks that had nothing to do with Alexandra's company, but everything to do with Victor's ability to orchestrate consequences from a distance.
"You don't have to worry about global tech anymore," Victor mentioned casually over dinner one evening, referring to the company that had been her main source of stress for months.
What do you mean? Alexandra asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer.
"I heard they're having some financial difficulties," Victor said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Something about irregularities in their accounting practices. Very unfortunate, but these things happen when companies try to grow too fast without proper oversight." Alexandra stared at him, trying to process what he was implying.
Victor, please tell me you didn't have anything to do with whatever's happening to global tech.
"Why would you think I had anything to do with it?" he asked, meeting her gaze with an expression of innocent confusion that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm just a businessman who pays attention to market trends." But Alexandra had spent years learning to read between the lines, to recognize when people were telling her carefully constructed half-truths. Victor's denial was technically accurate but fundamentally dishonest, and for the first time since she had met him, she felt a cold thread of fear weave its way through her infatuation. That night, as she lay in Victor's arms in his penthouse apartment that overlooked Central Park, Alexandra stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that her concerns were just the product of an overactive imagination. Victor had never done anything to hurt her, had never been anything but generous and caring and devoted to her happiness. But as she listened to his steady breathing and felt the coolness of his skin against hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was sleeping next to a stranger, a beautiful, charming, dangerous stranger who might be capable of things that the woman she used to be would never have been willing to overlook. The realization that she was changing, that her judgment might be compromised by emotions she had never experienced before, terrified her more than any cyber attack or corporate espionage attempt ever had, because for the first time in her adult life, Alexandra Sterling was in a situation where she wasn't in control of the outcome. And something deep in her gut told her that might be exactly what Victor Drakel had been counting on from the very beginning. The first crack in Alexandra's perfect world appeared on a Tuesday morning in November, disguised as a routine security audit that should have been as straightforward as breathing. She was reviewing access logs for one of her most sensitive clients, Senator Patricia Morrison, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Someone had accessed the senator's personal files at 3:47 a.m. 3 days earlier. The digital signature was almost perfect, sophisticated enough to fool most security systems, but Alexandra had designed these particular protocols herself. She knew every quirk, every potential vulnerability, every way someone might try to circumvent the safeguards she had built. What she was looking at was impossible. The access had been granted using authentication codes that only 3 people in the world possessed: herself, Senator Morrison, and the Senator's Chief of Staff, David Chen. But none of them had been anywhere near a computer at that time of night, and the digital fingerprint was subtly wrong. Like a master forger's work that was perfect, except for one tiny detail that only an expert would notice. Alexandra spent the rest of the morning tracing the intrusion, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of encryption and proxy servers. What she found made her hands shake as she typed. The breach had originated from an IP address that led back to a server farm in Eastern Europe, but the routing protocols had been disguised using techniques that were far too sophisticated for ordinary hackers. This wasn't the work of some college student looking to make a name for himself, or even a criminal organization seeking financial gain. This was the kind of operation that required resources, expertise, and access to technology that most governments couldn't afford. Someone with serious backing and serious skills had targeted one of her clients specifically, and they had come uncomfortably close to succeeding. But what truly terrified Alexandra was the timestamp on the initial probe attempts. They had started 6 weeks ago, just 2 days after her first dinner with Victor at that exclusive village restaurant. The timing could have been a coincidence, but in Alexandra's experience, coincidences in cybersecurity were usually evidence of careful planning rather than random chance. She spent the afternoon implementing additional security measures and quietly investigating whether any of her other clients had been targeted. What she discovered made her stomach churn with a combination of fear and fury that she had never experienced before. 4 other clients had been probed using similar techniques, all within the past month, all targeting information that would be valuable to someone with very specific interests in financial markets, political intelligence, and corporate espionage. As she studied the attack patterns, a horrible possibility began to take shape in her mind. The targets weren't random. They were all people she had mentioned to Victor during their conversations about her work, Not directly, and not in ways that would have seemed significant at the time, but enough for someone who was listening carefully to understand which of her clients might have access to information worth stealing. Alexandra closed her office door and spent the next hour conducting a forensic analysis that she prayed would prove her suspicions wrong. Instead, it confirmed her worst fears. Every attack had been launched within days of conversations where she had mentioned work challenges, difficult clients, or security concerns that kept her up at night. The man she had fallen in love with, the man she had trusted with her heart and her secrets and her carefully guarded vulnerabilities, had been using her as an intelligence source. Every intimate conversation had been a mining operation, every tender moment a chance to extract information that could be weaponized against the people she had sworn to protect. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that for a moment, Alexandra almost admired the tactical brilliance of it. Victor had identified her as a target, studied her weaknesses, and crafted an approach that would bypass every defense she possessed. He had made her fall in love with him so thoroughly that she had volunteered information she would never have shared with anyone else. But admiration quickly gave way to a rage so pure and consuming that it made her previous anger seem like gentle disappointment. Victor Drackle hadn't just broken her heart, he had turned her into an unwitting accomplice in attacks on people she cared about and respected. He had made her complicit in violations of trust that could destroy careers, compromise national security, and undermine everything she had worked to build. Alexandra forced herself to remain calm long enough to secure her systems and alert her affected clients through carefully coded communications that wouldn't reveal the source of the breach. Then she went home to her apartment and allowed herself exactly 1 hour to fall apart completely. She cried with the helpless fury of someone who had been played by an expert, who had ignored every instinct in favor of emotions she should have known better than to trust. When the hour was over, she dried her tears, poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon, and began planning Victor Drackle's destruction with the same methodical precision she had once applied to protecting him. The next morning, Alexandra called Victor and suggested they meet for lunch at a cafe near her office. She kept her voice light and casual, giving no hint that she knew what he really was or what he had done. When he agreed enthusiastically, she hung up the phone and smiled for the first time in 24 hours. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Victor arrived at the cafe looking as devastatingly handsome as always, his dark eyes lighting up when he saw her, as if she were the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered. He kissed her cheek with the same tenderness that had once made her knees weak, and for a split second, Alexandra almost convinced herself that she had been wrong about everything. Then she remembered Senator Morrison's files being accessed at 3 a.m, and her resolve hardened into something that could have cut diamond. "You look troubled," Victor observed as they settled into a corner booth. "Is everything all right with work?" The question was asked with such apparent concern that Alexandra marveled at his skill as a performer. If she hadn't known better, she would have believed that he genuinely cared about her well-being, rather than fishing for more information to exploit. "Actually, I had some interesting developments yesterday," she said, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "Someone tried to hack into Senator Morrison's systems using some very sophisticated techniques." Victor's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Alexandra caught the briefest flicker of something behind his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or calculation. It was gone so quickly that she might have imagined it, but she had spent her career learning to notice details that others missed. "That must be concerning," Victor said smoothly. "Any idea who might be responsible?" "We're investigating," Alexandra replied, taking a sip of her coffee and continuing to study his face. "The interesting thing is that whoever did it seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. Very targeted, very specific. Almost like they had inside information about the senator's digital infrastructure." This time, Victor's reaction was more pronounced. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his fingers drummed once against the table before he caught himself. To most people, he would have appeared completely calm, but Alexandra had become an expert at reading his subtle tells over the past month. "Inside information is always a concern," Victor said carefully. "I hope you're being careful about who you trust with sensitive details." The irony of the statement was so profound that Alexandra almost laughed out loud. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and dropped her voice to a more intimate level. "You know, it's funny that you mentioned trust. I was just thinking about how important it is to really know the people we let into our lives." Victor met her gaze steadily, but something in his expression had shifted. The warmth that had always been there when he looked at her was replaced by a cooler assessment, as if he were trying to determine how much she knew and what she planned to do about it. "Trust is earned," he said quietly, "but it's also fragile. Once broken, it's almost impossible to repair. I couldn't agree more, Alexandra said. And this time she didn't try to hide the steel in her voice. Which is why betrayal is such a serious matter, don't you think? For a long moment they stared at each other across the small table, and Alexandra felt like she was seeing Victor clearly for the first time. The charm was still there, the magnetic attraction that had drawn her to him like a moth to flame. But now she could see the calculation behind it, the cold intelligence that had orchestrated her seduction with such devastating effectiveness. Alexandra, Victor said finally, and his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret or might have been warning. Sometimes things are more complicated than they appear on the surface. Are you saying I should be careful about jumping to conclusions? She asked, her tone deceptively light. I'm saying that in my experience, people who dig too deeply into things that don't concern them sometimes find more than they bargain for. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Alexandra felt a thrill of fear mixed with fury. Victor was showing her his true face at last, giving her a glimpse of the man who operated in shadows and destroyed lives with the casual efficiency of someone ordering coffee. Good thing I've always enjoyed a challenge, she replied, standing up from the table with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Thank you for lunch, Victor. This has been very illuminating. She walked away without looking back, though she could feel his eyes following her until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. As she made her way back to her office, Alexandra's mind was already racing ahead, formulating plans and contingencies for the war she had just declared. Victor Drackle had underestimated her catastrophically. He had assumed that because she was in love with him, she would be weak, that her emotions would cloud her judgment and prevent her from taking action against him. He had forgotten that she hadn't built a successful cybersecurity company by being soft or forgiving when it came to threats against the people she protected. What Victor didn't know was that Alexandra Sterling had been preparing for this kind of fight her entire life. Every challenge she had faced, every obstacle she had overcome, every lesson she had learned about human nature and digital warfare had been training for this moment. He had taught her about power and manipulation, about the thrill of turning calculated risks into extraordinary rewards. Now she was going to use everything he had shown her against him, and she was going to make sure that when the dust settled, there would be no doubt about who had won and who had lost. That evening, Alexandra sat in her apartment with a glass of wine and her laptop, beginning the research that would eventually destroy Victor Drackle's carefully constructed empire. She started with the obvious searches, looking for any public information about his business dealings or personal background, but found the same carefully scrubbed results that had frustrated her earlier attempts to learn more about him. So she went deeper, using skills and resources that weren't available to ordinary investigators. She traced shell companies and offshore accounts, mapped networks of influence and obligation, and slowly began to piece together a picture of Victor's true operations that was far more extensive and far more sinister than she had ever imagined. Victor Drackle wasn't just a businessman with flexible ethics and mysterious connections. He was the center of a web of corruption that extended into governments, corporations, and institutions across multiple continents. He trafficked in information and influence, specializing in finding powerful people's secrets and using them to orchestrate outcomes that served his interests. The people Alexandra had met at his exclusive gatherings weren't just wealthy socialites and successful entrepreneurs. They were carefully selected pieces in a complex game where political decisions, market movements, and social trends were manipulated to generate profits for those who knew how to play the system. And Alexandra herself had been recruited as an unwitting asset in this operation. Her cybersecurity company gave Victor access to information networks that would have taken him years to penetrate through other means. By making her fall in love with him, he had turned her into a voluntary intelligence source who provided him with insights into the digital vulnerabilities of some of the most powerful people in the world. As she dug deeper into Victor's background, Alexandra discovered something that chilled her to the bone. She wasn't his first target. Over the past decade, there had been others, women with access to valuable information or influential networks, women who had been courted and seduced and ultimately discarded when they had served their purpose. Some of them had suffered mysterious business failures or personal scandals that had destroyed their careers. Others had simply disappeared from their previous lives, relocating to distant cities or foreign countries where they couldn't cause problems for Victor's operations. One woman, a federal prosecutor who had been investigating financial crimes that came uncomfortably close to Victor's network, had died in a car accident just weeks after ending their relationship. The official investigation had found nothing suspicious, but Alexandra's deeper digging revealed inconsistencies in the accident report that suggested professional intervention. As Alexandra stared at the evidence accumulating on her screen, She realized that she wasn't just dealing with corporate espionage or financial fraud. Victor Drackle was a predator who destroyed lives as casually as most people change clothes, and she had been marked as his next victim from the moment he first approached her at that charity gala. The knowledge should have terrified her into running as far and as fast as possible. Instead, it filled her with a cold determination that burned brighter than any emotion she had ever experienced. Victor had made a critical error in choosing her as his target. Unlike his previous victims, Alexandra Sterling had the skills, resources, and connections necessary to fight back, and she was going to make him pay for every life he had destroyed, every trust he had betrayed, every moment of happiness he had stolen from people who had made the mistake of believing in his lies. The war between them was about to begin, and Victor Drackle had no idea what he was up against. Alexandra spent 3 weeks planning her revenge with the same methodical precision that had made her cybersecurity company legendary among clients who faced the most sophisticated threats. Every morning she went to work as usual, maintaining the facade of a woman recovering from a difficult breakup. Every evening, she locked herself in her home office and constructed what would become Victor Drackle's worst nightmare. The key to destroying someone like Victor lay in understanding how he had built his power in the first place. He operated through networks of influence and information, using secrets and leverage to control outcomes from the shadows. His strength came from staying invisible, from ensuring that his victims never fully understood what had happened to them, or who was responsible. Alexandra was going to drag him into the light and burn down everything he had built, piece by piece, using his own methods against him. Her first target was Victor's financial infrastructure. Through careful analysis of transaction patterns and corporate relationships, she had mapped the maze of shell companies and offshore accounts that allowed him to move money without leaving traditional paper trails. The system was brilliant in its complexity, designed to confuse investigators and provide plausible deniability for every transaction. But complexity was also vulnerability. The more moving parts a system had, the more opportunities there were for someone with the right skills to introduce chaos into the mechanism. Alexandra began with subtle modifications to the algorithms that managed Victor's automated trading systems. She didn't steal money or transfer funds to accounts she controlled. Instead, she introduced tiny inefficiencies that would compound over time, causing his investments to underperform by margins too small to notice in the short term, but significant enough to erode his capital base over the long haul. Simultaneously, she started leaking carefully selected information about Victor's business practices to journalists and regulatory agencies that specialized in investigating financial crimes. She couldn't provide evidence of illegal activities without revealing how she had obtained that information, so she focused on creating questions that would prompt official investigations. Anonymous tips about unusual trading patterns landed on the desks of SEC investigators. Carefully crafted emails suggesting possible money laundering activities found their way to federal prosecutors who specialized in financial crimes. Documents highlighting suspicious international transactions appeared in the inboxes of reporters who had built careers on exposing corporate corruption. None of these revelations were smoking guns, but they created a drumbeat of scrutiny that made Victor's operations more difficult and more expensive to maintain. When you built your power on staying invisible, even small amounts of unwanted attention could be devastating. While she worked to undermine Victor's financial empire, Alexandra also began targeting his network of influence and control. She had identified 12 key individuals who served as intermediaries in Victor's operations, people who laundered his influence through legitimate institutions and provided him with access to information and decision-making processes. These people weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were lobbyists, consultants, and advisors who traded in favors and access, operating in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright corruption. Victor controlled them through a combination of financial incentives and carefully gathered leverage, compromising information that could destroy their careers if it became public. Alexandra decided to free them from Victor's control by eliminating his leverage. She began with Marcus Webb, a political consultant who had been feeding Victor insider information about upcoming regulatory decisions in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Webb's weakness was a gambling addiction that he had managed to hide from his wife and clients through careful manipulation of his business accounts. Instead of exposing Webb's addiction, Alexandra did something far more damaging to Victor's interests. She arranged for Webb to win big at several carefully chosen gambling venues. Anonymous tips led Webb to poker games where the opposition was weak and the stakes were manageable. Mysterious bonuses appeared in his consulting contracts from clients who had never existed but whose money was perfectly legitimate. Within a month, Webb had paid off his gambling debts and accumulated enough savings to feel secure for the first time in years. When Victor next approached him for information, Webb politely declined, explaining that he was reducing his consulting work to focus on his family. Without the financial pressure that had made him vulnerable to Victor's manipulation, Webb was free to walk away. Alexandra repeated variations of this strategy with other members of Victor's network. A corporate lawyer with a son who needed expensive medical treatment found that his insurance company had mysteriously approved previously denied claims. A lobbyist who had been stealing from client accounts to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle received a legitimate inheritance from a distant relative's estate that had been tied up in probate for years. In each case, Alexandra removed the leverage that Victor had used to control these people, giving them the freedom to step away from his operations without destroying their lives in the process. It was a more elegant approach than simple exposure, and it had the added benefit of demonstrating to Victor that someone was systematically dismantling his power structure. But Alexandra's masterpiece was her campaign against Victor's information networks. She had identified the digital systems that he used to gather intelligence on his targets, and she had developed a strategy to turn those systems against him. Victor's operation relied heavily on electronic surveillance and data mining, using sophisticated malware and social engineering techniques to gather information about people's vulnerabilities and secrets. His cybersecurity measures were excellent, but they were designed to protect against external threats, not against someone who understood his methods and motivations as intimately as Alexandra did. She began by feeding false information into the systems that Victor used to monitor potential targets. Fake financial records suggested that certain politicians were more corruptible than they actually were, leading Victor's operatives to waste time and resources on approaches that were doomed to fail. Fabricated personal communications created the illusion that certain business leaders were involved in scandals that didn't exist, causing Victor to base strategic decisions on intelligence that was completely incorrect. More insidiously, Alexandra used her access to Victor's surveillance networks to monitor his own operations. Every time he dispatched operatives to gather information or apply pressure to potential targets, she was able to provide those targets with advance warning through anonymous communications that appeared to come from whistleblowers or concerned citizens. Political figures received vague but accurate warnings about people who might try to compromise them. Business leaders found themselves coincidentally increasing their cybersecurity measures just days before sophisticated attacks would have succeeded. Journalists investigating stories that threatened Victor's interests received tips about additional sources and documentation that strengthened their reporting. The cumulative effect was to make Victor's operations increasingly ineffective, while simultaneously alerting his targets to the fact that someone was systematically targeting them. This created a climate of heightened security and suspicion that made it much more difficult for Victor to operate with his previous invisibility. As Alexandra's campaign continued, she noticed signs that Victor was beginning to realize he was under attack. His business activities became more cautious, his financial transactions more complex, and his personal security measures more extensive. He started varying his routines and using different routes to travel between locations, suggesting that he was concerned about surveillance or physical threats. Most tellingly, he began trying to contact her. The calls started casually, with Victor suggesting that they meet for coffee to discuss their misunderstanding from their last conversation. When Alexandra ignored those overtures, the messages became more direct, with Victor expressing concern for her well-being and suggesting that she might be taking unnecessary risks. Finally, the pretense dropped entirely. Victor left a voicemail that lasted less than 30 seconds but conveyed a clear message. Alexandra, I think we need to talk. Some situations can escalate beyond what anyone intended, and I would hate to see you get caught up in something that could have serious consequences for your career and your safety. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Alexandra found herself both furious and oddly satisfied by Victor's willingness to drop his charming mask. For the first time since their relationship began, he was being completely honest with her about who he was and what he was capable of doing. She responded by escalating her own operations. If Victor wanted to threaten her, she would show him exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate someone with her skills and resources. Alexandra's next target was Victor's reputation within the exclusive circles where he had built his influence. Using the same social engineering techniques that had made her cybersecurity company successful, she began spreading carefully crafted rumors that called Victor's reliability and discretion into question. Anonymous sources suggested to influential people that Victor had been careless with sensitive information, that his security measures were not as robust as he claimed, and that working with him might expose them to unnecessary risks. These whispers didn't make specific accusations, but they created doubt about Victor's competence and trustworthiness. Simultaneously, Alexandra arranged for some of Victor's past victims to receive anonymous packages containing evidence of how they had been manipulated and exploited. She was careful to provide information that these people could act on without compromising her own security, focusing on evidence that could support civil lawsuits or regulatory complaints rather than criminal prosecutions. The federal prosecutor, whose car accident had been suspiciously convenient, received documentation suggesting that her death had been staged to look accidental. The evidence was compelling but not conclusive, designed to reopen the investigation without providing a clear path back to Alexandra as the source. Business leaders who had suffered mysterious failures after ending relationships with Victor received analyses showing how their company's digital systems had been compromised during the periods when they had been involved with him. Again, the evidence was suggestive rather than definitive, but it was enough to prompt them to hire forensic investigators and pursue legal remedies. As Alexandra's campaign gained momentum, Victor's attempts to contact her became more frequent and more urgent. He tried calling her office, sending messages through mutual acquaintances, and even appearing at places where he knew she might be found. Each attempt was politely but firmly rebuffed, leaving Victor with no way to gauge how much she knew or what she planned to do with that knowledge. The uncertainty was clearly driving him to desperation. His business operations began showing signs of serious stress as deals fell through, partnerships dissolved, and sources of information dried up. The financial hemorrhaging that Alexandra had engineered was beginning to affect his ability to maintain the expensive infrastructure that his operations required. More importantly, Victor was losing the invisibility that had been his greatest asset. News stories about regulatory investigations into suspicious financial activities began mentioning his name, though always in passing and without specific accusations. Congressional staffers started asking questions about his connections to lobbyists and political consultants. Federal agents began reviewing files that mentioned him as a peripheral figure in various investigations. None of these developments represented immediate threats to Victor's freedom or safety, but they created a pattern of exposure that would make it increasingly difficult for him to operate with his previous impunity. People in his line of work depended on staying off official radars, and Alexandra was systematically ensuring that Victor became visible to every relevant authority. As winter deepened into spring, Alexandra watched Victor's empire crumble with the same methodical patience that she had applied to building it. Every week brought new signs of his deteriorating position, key operatives disappearing from his network, financial resources becoming harder to access, and opportunities for profitable manipulation evaporating as his targets became aware of the threats they faced. The most satisfying aspect of Alexandra's campaign was its surgical precision. She'd managed to destroy Victor's power without exposing herself to serious legal or physical risks, and without causing collateral damage to innocent people who had been caught up in his operations. Her victims were being freed from his control, his crimes were being investigated by appropriate authorities, and his ability to hurt other people was being systematically eliminated. But Alexandra knew that a man like Victor Drackle would not go quietly into defeat. As his situation became more desperate, he would become more dangerous, willing to take risks and use methods that he might have avoided when his position was secure. She was prepared for that escalation. In fact, she was counting on it, because Alexandra Sterling had one final card to play, one devastating revelation that would complete Victor's destruction and ensure that he could never threaten anyone again. The endgame was approaching, and Alexandra intended to make sure that when the final hand was played, there would be no doubt about who held the winning cards. The final confrontation came on a rainy Thursday evening in April, exactly 6 months after Alexandra had first discovered Victor's betrayal. She had been expecting him to make a desperate move as his empire continued to crumble around him, but she was still surprised when he appeared in her apartment building's lobby, looking haggard and desperate in a way that would have been unthinkable during their relationship. The charming mask had finally slipped completely. Victor's usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his dark eyes held a combination of fury and desperation that made him look genuinely dangerous for the first time since she had known him. When the doorman announced his presence, Alexandra felt a thrill of fear mixed with satisfaction. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the final act of the drama they had been performing for each other. "Send him up," she told the doorman, then spent the next 5 minutes checking the digital recording devices she had hidden throughout her apartment and confirming that the security company she had hired was monitoring the situation remotely. If Victor had come to threaten or harm her, there would be multiple witnesses and immediate law enforcement response. But when Victor entered her apartment, he didn't seem interested in physical violence. Instead, he looked like a man who had been stripped of everything he valued and was trying to understand how his carefully constructed world had collapsed so completely.
"You magnificent, terrifying woman," he said without any preamble. standing in her living room like an unwelcome ghost from a past life. I underestimated you catastrophically.
Yes, you did, Alexandra replied calmly, positioning herself near the kitchen counter, where she had easy access to several potential weapons and emergency communication devices.
The question is, what are you planning to do about it? Victor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. What can I do? You've systematically destroyed everything I spent 15 years building. My financial networks are bleeding money, my information sources have disappeared, my political connections are avoiding my calls, and every law enforcement agency in the country has my name on their radar. That was the plan, Alexandra said simply. You made the mistake of thinking I would be easy to dispose of when you were finished with me. I never intended to dispose of you, Victor protested, and for a moment, something that might have been genuine regret flickered across his features. What we had was real, Alexandra. At least, it became real for me. Nothing about our relationship was real, Alexandra shot back, feeling her carefully controlled anger threaten to break free. Every conversation was an intelligence-gathering operation. Every touch was manipulation. Every word of love was a lie designed to make me more compliant and more useful to your operations. Victor moved closer, and Alexandra tensed, ready to defend herself if necessary. But instead of threatening her, he sank down onto her couch like a man who had run out of strength to stand. You're right about most of it, he admitted quietly. I targeted you because of your company, because of the access you could provide to information I needed. I studied your psychology, identified your vulnerabilities, and crafted an approach designed to make you fall in love with me. And the fact that you're admitting this is supposed to make me feel better? Alexandra asked incredulously. I'm admitting it because somewhere along the way, it stopped being an act for me, Victor said, looking up at her with an expression that was raw with something that might have been honesty. I fell in love with you, Alexandra. Really, genuinely in love with you. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself caring more about someone else's happiness than my own objectives. Alexandra stared at him, trying to process this revelation. Part of her wanted to believe that some aspect of their relationship had been real, that the connection she had felt hadn't been completely manufactured. But she had learned too much about Victor's methods to trust anything he said, especially when he was desperate and cornered. If that's true, she said carefully, then why didn't you stop? Why didn't you walk away before you destroyed everything between us? Because I'm a coward, Victor replied simply. I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, what I really did, you would leave me. So I kept lying, kept manipulating, kept telling myself that I could find a way to protect you from the truth while still keeping you in my life. And meanwhile, you were using information I shared with you to attack my clients, Alexandra pointed out. People I cared about, people I had sworn to protect. Victor winced as if she had struck him physically. I tried to minimize the damage. I never targeted anyone you specifically asked me to protect, and I made sure that the breaches were detected before any real harm could be done. You made sure the breaches were detected? Alexandra repeated, her mind racing as she processed this new information.
Are you saying you deliberately left clues that would expose the attacks?
Subtle ones, Victor admitted. Just enough to trigger your security protocols without making it obvious that someone had inside information. I thought I could walk a line between serving my obligations and protecting your interests. Alexandra felt a strange mixture of vindication and disappointment. She had been right to trust her instincts about the attacks being too obvious, too easily detected. Victor had been sabotaging his own operations to avoid causing her serious professional damage, which explained why she had been able to trace the breaches so quickly. Your obligations, she repeated. To whom? For the first time since entering her apartment, Victor hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. There are people who control my operations, Alexandra. People who wouldn't understand or forgive my conflicted loyalties. Walking away wasn't an option for me. But it is now? She asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. Now, I don't have a choice, Victor said with bitter laugh. Thanks to your campaign, I don't have operations left to control. My handlers have made it clear that I'm now a liability rather than an asset. I'm on my own for the first time in 15 years, and I have no idea how to be anything other than what I've been. Alexandra found herself faced with a moral dilemma she hadn't anticipated. Throughout her campaign of revenge, she had focused on destroying Victor's power and protecting his victims. She hadn't given much thought to what would happen to Victor himself once his empire collapsed. Now, looking at this broken man sitting in her living room, She realized that he was as much a victim of the system he had served as anyone else. He had been recruited young, trained to manipulate and exploit others, and trapped in a web of obligations that made escape seem impossible. That didn't excuse the harm he had caused, but it complicated her feelings about what justice actually looked like in this situation. "What do you want from me, Victor?" she asked finally. "I want you to know that I'm sorry," he said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since arriving. "I'm sorry for lying to you, for using you, for putting you in danger, and for destroying the best thing that ever happened to me through my own cowardice and selfishness." "And?" Alexandra prompted, sensing that there was more. "And I want to give you something that might help you understand why this all happened," Victor said, reaching into his jacket with movements slow enough to demonstrate that he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "Information about the people who controlled my operations, about their methods and objectives and other operatives they have in place." He withdrew a small device that looked like an ordinary USB drive, but was probably loaded with encryption and security protocols that would make it invisible to most scanning devices. "Everything I know about the network," Victor continued. "Names, locations, financial structures, operational methods, and current targets. Enough information to shut down the entire organization and protect future victims from what happened to you." Alexandra stared at the device, understanding that she was being offered something far more valuable than simple revenge. This information could prevent countless other people from suffering what she had suffered, could expose a network of corruption that extended far beyond Victor's individual crimes. "Why?" she asked. "Why give me this? What do you get out of destroying the people you worked for?" "Revenge," Victor said simply. "They used me for 15 years, turned me into someone I never wanted to be, and then discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. They destroyed my life as thoroughly as you destroyed my operations, but they did it without the courtesy of making it personal." Alexandra realized that Victor was offering her a partnership of sorts, a chance to work together to destroy the larger system that had created and controlled him. It was a tempting offer both strategically and emotionally. Part of her still cared about the man she thought she had fallen in love with, and the idea of helping him find redemption was appealing. But she had learned too much about Victor's capacity for deception to trust him completely, even in his apparent desperation. This could be an elaborate manipulation, a final attempt to regain some leverage over her by offering her something she couldn't resist. "How do I know this information is genuine?" she asked. "How do I know this isn't another attempt to manipulate me?" Victor smiled sadly. "You don't. But you're smart enough to verify anything I give you before you act on it. And you're skilled enough to protect yourself if this turns out to be some kind of trap." He stood up from the couch and placed the USB drive on her coffee table, then stepped back to demonstrate that he wasn't trying to force her to take it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to trust me or believe that what I felt for you was real. I just want to do one thing right before I disappear forever." Alexandra stared at the device sitting on her table like a small black talisman that might contain either salvation or damnation. Taking it would mean accepting Victor's final offer, agreeing to use the information he provided, even though doing so might put her at risk from people who are apparently more dangerous and more ruthless than Victor himself. But refusing it would mean allowing those people to continue operating, to find and groom other victims, to perpetuate a system of exploitation and corruption that had already caused immeasurable harm.
"If I take this," she said slowly, "what happens to you?" "I disappear," Victor replied.
"New identity, new location, new life. I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to become someone worth being." "And if I don't take it?" Victor shrugged. "The same thing happens, but fewer people get the chance to be free of the system that created me." Alexandra reached for the USB drive, her fingers closing around the small device that felt warm despite Victor's typically cool skin. As she touched it, she felt like she was making a decision that would define the rest of her life, choosing between safety and justice, between personal peace and a larger responsibility to protect others. "There's one more thing," Victor said as she pocketed the drive. "The people who controlled my operations won't be happy about what you've done to me. They may decide that you know too much to be allowed to continue operating freely." "Is that a threat?" Alexandra asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife she kept in the kitchen drawer. "It's a warning," Victor said seriously. "You've made powerful enemies, and they don't have my sentimental attachment to your well-being. Be careful, Alexandra. What you've accomplished is extraordinary, but it may have painted a target on your back that will never fade." With that ominous warning, Victor walked toward her door, pausing only to look back at her one final time. "For what it's worth," he said, I really did love you. That was the one true thing in all the lies. Then he was gone, leaving Alexandra alone, with a USB drive full of dangerous secrets and the knowledge that her war with Victor Drackle was over, but her larger fight might just be beginning. Over the next month, Alexandra carefully analyzed the information Victor had provided, using every security protocol she possessed to verify its authenticity, without exposing herself to potential traps or surveillance. What she found confirmed Victor's claims about the scope and sophistication of the network that had controlled his operations. The organization was international in scope, with tentacles reaching into governments, corporations, and institutions across multiple continents. They specialized in what they called influence architecture, using carefully placed operatives to manipulate political decisions, market movements, and social trends in ways that generated enormous profits for their clients. Victor had been just one of dozens of operatives, each assigned to specific targets and objectives, each believing they were working for different organizations that were actually fronts for the same central authority. The compartmentalized structure made it almost impossible for any individual operative to expose the entire network, even if they wanted to. But Victor's position had given him access to information that no single operative was supposed to possess. His handlers had trusted him with coordination responsibilities that required him to know about multiple operations simultaneously, and he had used that access to map the entire organization. Armed with Victor's intelligence and her own investigative skills, Alexandra began constructing what would become the largest takedown of organized corruption in modern history. She shared carefully selected portions of the information with journalists, law enforcement agencies, and regulatory bodies around the world, coordinating the releases to create maximum impact while protecting her own identity. The resulting investigations exposed corruption scandals that toppled governments, destroyed criminal enterprises, and sent hundreds of people to prison. Financial markets crashed as investors learned about manipulation schemes that had artificially inflated asset prices. Political careers ended as officials were revealed to have been puppets in elaborate influence operations. Through it all, Alexandra maintained her anonymity, operating through intermediaries and digital communications that couldn't be traced back to her. She had learned from Victor's example about the importance of staying invisible, of working through others to achieve objectives without exposing herself to retaliation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using Victor's own methods to destroy the system that had created him, but she told herself that there was a fundamental difference between her operations and theirs. She was working to expose corruption and protect victims, while they had been working to create corruption and exploit victims. Whether that distinction would matter to the surviving members of the network remained to be seen. Victor's warning about making powerful enemies proved prophetic. As Alexandra found herself the target of increasingly sophisticated surveillance and harassment campaigns clearly designed to identify her as the source of the leaks that were destroying their operations. But Alexandra Sterling had spent her entire adult life protecting herself and others from digital threats, and she was more than capable of defending herself against people who had underestimated her once and were now making the same mistake again. As she sat in her office 1 year after Victor had disappeared from her life forever, Alexandra reflected on how completely her world had changed. She had lost her innocence about human nature and her faith in love, but she had gained something potentially more valuable: the knowledge that she was capable of fighting monsters and winning, that she could take the worst betrayal imaginable and transform it into a weapon for justice. Victor Drackle had mocked her love by treating it as a tool to be exploited for his own purposes. In response, she had made sure he suffered consequences that would echo through his life and the lives of everyone who had enabled his crimes. But more importantly, she had ensured that his victims would never be forgotten, that his crimes would never be repeated, and that the system that had created him would never threaten innocent people again. Love might be dangerous, Alexandra had learned, but a woman scorned was absolutely lethal when she possessed the skills and determination to fight back. And sometimes that was exactly what the world needed: someone willing to wage war against the darkness, regardless of the personal cost. The Vampire King was dead, metaphorically speaking. His empire was ashes, his victims were free, and his secrets had been turned into weapons that would protect future generations from similar predators. Alexandra Sterling had gotten her revenge, and in the process, she had discovered something about herself that was far more powerful than love: the absolute certainty that she would never again allow anyone to make her a victim. In the end, that knowledge was worth more than any relationship, any romance, any promise of happily ever after. Because happiness was temporary, but strength was forever. And Alexandra Sterling had become very, very strong indeed.